it's time for the conversation.
Definitely. And of course, on the conversation, we'll be discussing issues in Mali and Sudan. We would know that there have been continued protests in Sudan despite lots of talks for negotiation. And meanwhile, in Mali, the Economic Community of West African States, as ECOWAS, have sanctioned Mali. And of course, it has brought a lot of economic implications on the country. Meanwhile, Mali junta have said that they have called the sanctions illegal and have also blocked their borders. And this has caused lots of issues. And that's what we'll be discussing on today's edition of The Conversation. Meanwhile, we have the World Youth Forum, which is ongoing. We've had lots of people talking about it, seeing youths come to talk about why we should have more youths involved in politics. Inclusion
in politics. And it's instructive to note that News Central has presence on the ground in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and will be giving you up-to-date reports and happenings there.
Now, we're looking at today's edition, and in a sharp escalation after months of simmering diplomatic tensions, leaders from the Economic Community of West African State, ECOWAS, agreed to shorter borders with the Sahel state and impose a trade embargo in Mali.
Now, the decision was backed on Monday by France, Mali's former colonial power at the United Nations Security Council. The West African bloc also agreed to cut financial aid, freeze Mali's assets at the Central Bank of West African States, and also to recall ambassadors from the country.
The authority find the proposed chronogram for a transition totally unacceptable. This chronogram simply means that an illegitimate military transition government will take the Malian people hostage during the next 5 years. The authority decide to uphold the initial sanction already imposed on Mali and on the transition authorities. The authority also decide to impose additional sanction, economic and financial sanction, in conformity with its deliberation at the 60th Ordinary Session held on 12 December 2021 in Abuja, Federal Republic of Nigeria. These additional sanctions include, first, the withdrawal of ambassadors of all ECOWAS member states in Mali. Second, closure of land and air border between ECOWAS member countries and Mali. Third, suspension of all commercial and financial transactions between ECOWAS member states and Mali, with the exception of the following product: essential food product, pharmaceutical product, medical supply and equipment, including material for the control of COVID-19, petroleum product, and electricity. 4, freeze of assets of the Republic of Mali in ECOWAS central banks. 5, freeze of assets of the Malian state and the state enterprises and parastatal in all commercial banks. Finally, the suspension of Mali from all financial assistance and transaction from all financial institutions in ECOWAS region.
Now, you've heard all the sanctions placed by ECOWAS, but in the meantime, Mali's government has called for nationwide demonstrations on Friday against stringent sanctions imposed by ECOWAS over the delayed elections. Let us take a listen to Mali's military leader, Assimi Goïta's response to ECOWAS.
Je dois vous dire que même si nous regrettons le caractère illégitime, illégal et inhumain de certaines décisions, le Mali reste ouvert au dialogue avec la CEDEAO pour trouver un consensus entre les intérêts supérieurs du peuple malien et le respect des principes fondamentaux de l'organisation.
Join us on the conversation this evening to discuss all of this recent development and the ECOWAS sanctions and political and economic implications for Mali is Ayodele Lawal Adio, the managing editor, Avalon Daily, and Professor Kwesi Aning, Director of Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research at the Kofi Annan Institute for Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like to start with Professor Aning. Mali's leaders say elections can hold next month because of security concerns in the country. They also want time to draft a new constitution. Are these reasons not germane enough to ask for the polls to be postponed?
Well, I think from where I sit, the reasons sound reasonable, that there was a certain hastiness in the request and the demands by ECOWAS to reverse some of the original decisions that the Malian junta had made. And I think the unfortunately strict adherence to aspects of the Charter on Democracy, which, by the way, is not applied consistently across board, which hopefully we may come to that, strengthens the arguments from Bamako about the need to allow the junta some space to create a political platform that allows multiple stakeholders to take part. And for me, I think dialogue is the way forward. I don't believe that the sanctions that have been imposed on Mali right now will achieve the results that we are all looking for. The space for dialogue still exists, and I think for the collective sanctity and stability of the sub-region, we need to allow dialogue to continue.
All right, dialogue and not sanctions. Let's hear from Adio. Will the sanctions by ECOWAS put the junta led by Colonel Assimi Goïta back on the path to civilian rule? And how effective do you think these sanctions will be?
But I'm not really one to support, economic sanctions, whether it's within Africa or when big European nations use sanctions as a negotiating tool, because I've always argued that sanctions have an overbearing impact on the vulnerable citizens in the country, whereas it impacts the leaders who actually are the perpetrators of the acts that are supposedly being punished for. So usually you have citizens carry the brunt of these sanctions, and the leaders that you're trying to punish usually have a way around it. However, I think ECOWAS has found itself between a rock and a hard place. It cannot just sit back and allow countries around, the West African region continue to fall under military dictatorship and do nothing about it. My argument is that it has to take a stand against a military incursion. It has to take a stand against military coup and a stand for democracy. But while it tries to do that, I think that there also has to be some sort of a middle ground that allows some wiggle room for negotiations to continue until that can be achieved. But to that extent, I do not agree that the military needs about 5 years to draft a constitution and to prepare themselves for a transition into civilian rule. That, I believe, is outrageous. At the very least, because elections were supposed to hold in February, and it seems a bit unrealistic for that to happen, given the circumstances on ground and the argument that a constitution can be ready in that time frame. So I would argue that the military government can be given until the end of the year to put a constitution together and to begin the process of preparing for elections in the coming year. It does not need 5 years to plan for an election. That is just an excuse to sit tight and hold on to power for as long as possible, which should not be tolerated, by the ECOWAS.
Thank you, Ayodele. Now, Professor Aning, Mali was struggling economically even before the military took over, and we do understand the socio-economic conditions of the country. The sanctions have now cut off trade and travel with the landlocked country already suffering from violence amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Aren't these sanctions a bit too harsh? And like Ayodele said in its submission, ECOWAS too needs to take a stand. They found themselves between a rock and a hard place. So are these sanctions too harsh? judging by the prevailing socio-economic conditions in Mali?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with Ayodele very much. ECOWAS placed itself voluntarily between a rock and a hard place, precisely because it has had this incapacity to apply the norms and the values inherent in its own protocols and conventions consistently across board. So when we argue about a military coup, there can also be democratic coups or coup d'etats closed with it under the garb of democratic processes. So when people change constitutions, fiddle with electoral processes, and maintain power, those are coup d'etats. But when those things happen, we really don't hear very much coming out of Abuja. So therein lies the near moral stance and that nationalistic drive that the Malians or the junta in Bamako is using, exploiting, let me use that word. I agree with Ayodele 100% that, look, we've gone through cycles of dictatorship, of brutality, of abuse, of disrespectful rule of law, human rights, and we can't allow it to happen. Countries and communities thrive best when we all have an opportunity to express our views, diverse as they may be.
But Prof, I'd like to, sorry to interrupt you, Prof, I'd like to butt in here. You mentioned something quite instructive, that when there is a democratic coup, like the situation we saw with Alpha Conde, he changed the terms of the constitution. We also saw that in Burkina Faso with Blaise Compaoré. ECOWAS does not say anything, but how can they intervene going forward without it looking like they're interfering in the domestic affairs of a sovereign nation?
So I think if we take the Gambian case, for example, the Jawara case,
yes,
when Jawara refused to hand over power after accepting his loss, Jammeh. Gambia is a small country. ECOWAS managed to intervene with Senegalese support. And then, of course, we saw the change take place. Mali is a slightly larger country. Its location is much more strategic. There are geopolitical interests coming in with China and Russia and the Wagner Group now. Both Russia and France have just shut down a French resolution in the Security Council. So what we are seeing is that, and of course, we haven't heard very much about Guinea, because in Guinea we know that huge mining interests, once more Russia, China, and even France itself are very interested in the mining resources in Guinea. So the regime in Bamako is reading these signals very well, I think, exploiting the geopolitical shifts and changes, but irrespective of whatever weaknesses may emanate from Abuja and the changes that we are seeing on the sub-region, we need a backdoor channel of negotiation. And once more, I agree with Ayodele, even though my difference might be that for me, the 5-year target was an opening gambit from Bamako for negotiations. I'm sure we can come to 2 years, because quite a lot of the people who are raising the big stick themselves have some very disturbing skeletons in their cupboards.
Exactly.
So the moral imperative by those who are wielding the stick is actually quite weak. And we are seeing the manner in which words that probably young people do not really relate to is being brought in. Issues of sovereignty, national identity, the stripping up of national feelings. And I can imagine what will happen on Friday. All these people coming with one voice to say, we are Malians, we are free, we have a right to decide for ourselves. So let's keep a back channel open. Let's keep the conversations open. I think from the ECOWAS perspective, we've gone through much more difficult stages before, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, La Côte d'Ivoire, and elsewhere. So we have the experience. Let's show some leadership. Let's show some willingness to listen. And I'm quite sure, as Ayodele is saying, that probably within the next 12 to 18, 24 months, we should have a newly elected democratic regime in Bamako.
Okay. I like your positivity and I like the fact that you've brought in Guinea, but let's take a look at Guinea's response and I'll come back to you, Ayodele.
L'opinion nationale et internationale que la République de Guinée n'a, par conséquent, en aucune façon été associée à la décision du 4e sommet extraordinaire des chefs d'État de la CEDEAO.
Now, we've heard the responses from Guinea. Ayodele, earlier on, you mentioned that the sanctions are a bit too tough. And a lot of observers will say that sanctions may further destabilize the region. You also mentioned the fact that ECOWAS should wait till about 1 year. But we know how the military junta is. And you also talked about ECOWAS taking a stand. Don't you think this is a stand of ECOWAS? This is the time to talk tough on military junta. Because if we wait a year, as Professor Kwesi said, we might be going to 2 years and even 3 years, and in the same way, going in the line of the military junta. So don't you think ECOWAS has finally taken a strong stand against a military junta in Mali?
Listen, ECOWAS itself is standing on spaghetti legs. It has member nations that have all sorts of skeletons in their cupboard. Many of them just masquerading as democratic nations, whereas if you look into their internal mechanisms or their internal operations, you will see that many of the leaders are strong-armed. And it is also important to note that many of the member nations in this ECOWAS region are countries with high level of poverty, unemployment, and low human development index. So where is the moral right? Where is the what you would call the poster nation that has lifted its citizens out of poverty, that can be a shining light for democracy and what democracy can do for its citizens, where the Malian government in Bamako can draw an example from, or where ECOWAS can use as a compelling narrative to nudge the government in Bamako towards a quick transition into civilian administration. So you have a case where, and you have to recall that when this coup happened in the very first instance, when President Keita was toppled, there were excitements in the streets of Bamako.
Yes.
Citizens were excited about the coup. It tells you that the country had been badly run. Poverty was on the increase. Young people had their dreams completely cut off. You also had a country where the northern part are largely controlled by terrorists who have attempted to make their way up onto the central government, of course, except for with the help of the French and international forces that have continued to push them backwards. So you have a really ugly situation in the West African region, where very few countries have the moral right to bully Bamako. And in this instance, the answers are very difficult to come by.
But due to these sanctions, sorry to butt in there, but due to these sanctions, we've now finally heard from the military junta asking for dialogue, saying that they're open for dialogue.
Yeah, of course. And as long as that door is open, I think it's an opportunity for member states to seize that opportunity and to engage in that conversation. Former President Goodluck Jonathan, I think, is a man who has the temperament, given the fact that he lost an election and he willingly conceded that election. I would assume that he has the kind of temperament to continue to negotiate with the government in Bamako in good faith, and to see that the interest of the citizens of that country and the young people whose aspirations are being trapped under global and local politics are being placed first. And I think that if we negotiate in good faith, and if we engage the government in Bamako in good faith, I think that we'll come to a reasonable agreement in the next 12 to 24 months. we just have to come with clean hands, be open-minded, and place the citizens of that country first, and not be hasty to place unrealistic sanctions, to shut borders and cut off trade that will only further impoverish the people and also lead to create the breeding ground for non-state actors to continue to take over to continue to exploit the situation, and to create the breeding ground for more military incursions into the governing affairs of the country.
Thank you very much, Ayodele. Now, Professor Aning, Colonel Assimi Goita has blamed the unseen hand of foreign powers, but everyone presumes this to mean France. They're the elephant in the room here. The former colonial power still has 4,800 troops deployed in the battle against jihadist insurgents in the north. And we also understand the geopolitical complexities with Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group, and China coming into place. So what do you make of these allegations? A lot of people have said, ECOWAS is just doing the bidding of Paris. What do you make of this?
Well, Paris is a bad boy. I mean, they've caused havoc on this continent, on the sub-region. They've looted Mali. And let me go back to 2012, when the crisis began and the Malian government supposedly invited Paris for support. President Hollande then said they had entered Mali and dispersed the terrorists. And therein lies the unnecessary expansion and dispersal of these violent people. But France has never taken responsibility for that dramatic military mistake in creating instability in the sub-region. The narrative emanating from Paris and the choice of words, when you subject them to any discourse analysis, perceives Bamako as lacking agency, as an infantile country governed by infantile people.
I mean, why would they do that 60 years post-independence? Where's that assumption coming from?
Because in most of their former colonies, it's Paris that still drives the agenda. So you see the manner in which heads of states from their former colonies rush to Paris for instructions. Two people are assassinated by terrorists, or their former colonies and their leaders will rush to Paris, hold hands, walk on the streets, and then thousands of their own people are being killed in their country, and they don't even issue a statement. So what the Malians are showing us, and also in Niger, is that the history of France's brutalities and manipulations are beginning to be laid bare. And that arrogance of Paris in threatening to leave if the Malians don't play ball was out of the assumption and the misreading of the geopolitical space that Goita and his deputy had studied in Russia, and that the Russians were watching. What we are seeing is a resurgent Russia with the Mr. Putin playing the long diplomatic and defense game. He's a patient man. He's read the tea leaves. He knew the role of the Soviet Union then in most of these countries, laying the basis for development. So there's an emotional attachment to Russia, and that attachment to, say, France is much more hostile. And it is this change that ECOWAS's strategic thinkers must be placing within their instrument or their toolbox to say, how do we interpret and analyze our own protocols and conventions and apply them within the context of a dramatically changing geopolitical space. Now, when people call the Wagner Group mercenaries, I just laugh. Because had those groups come from Paris, from London, from US, from Canada, and how many of these groups are not gallivanting across this sub-region and claiming that they are giving bilateral military aid? So once more, this is a play on words. as a sovereign country, the Wagner Group can be invited, agreement signed. We may not like their style, but it is not up to us to stand on the sidelines wishing that the Wagner Group is not there so we can send in our own groups. What didn't other mercenary groups do in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere? Executive outcomes in Sierra Leone, Liberia. So I don't buy this argument at all. African scholarship and critical African scholarship must begin to raise these questions and put question marks around the manner in which externals want to interpret and present our lived experiences to us.
Okay, while we're still talking about an involvement of international powers, we also know that Russia and China have blocked the United Nations Security Council from backing the ECOWAS sanctions. Meanwhile, the government in Mali has called for demonstrations on Friday against the ECOWAS sanctions. So let's take a look at reactions in Mali.
Nous sommes pour une transition réussie. Oui, nous sommes pour une transition de courte durée. Nous sommes pour une transition qui évite au Mali des sanctions internationales. C'est pourquoi nous avons jugé nécessaire de venir prêter main forte au mouvement et de dire que ce chronogramme qui est déraisonnable d'abord, il faut le reconnaître. C'est une transition qui peut durer jusqu'à 6 ans, n'est pas une transition mais un mandat présidentiel.
Nous, on a créé la CEDEAO pour avoir une entente, pour faire une communauté homogène, mais pas un club. Aujourd'hui, la CEDEAO, c'est un club. Et le club-là, ça va à l'encontre de l'Afrique. Ça va à l'encontre de l'Afrique, de la population ouest africaine. Donc, nous ne sommes pas partants avec cette décision.
Ça ne nous surprend pas. La CEDEAO, là, actuellement, c'est le syndicat des chefs d'État. C'est le syndicat des chefs d'État. Nous, depuis 2012, nous sommes en embargo. Si les militaires avaient demandé un mois, la CEDEAO va prendre cette sanction-là. C'est prémédité. Nous, on n'a pas besoin d'eux.
Faire le bras de fer avec la CEDEAO, c'est pas bien parce que déjà nous sommes aujourd'hui devant des sanctions qui, on ne sait pas où est-ce que ça pourra conduire notre pays. Ça c'est un. Mais deuxième point, si il faut que le Mali se libère, je pense que ce bras de fer est nécessaire pour la liberté du Mali.
Au regard de tous les problèmes que le Mali vit depuis 2012, c'est une sanction vraiment sévère. Donc j'aurais voulu, même si les sanctions soient beaucoup plus légères, quoi. Sinon ces sanctions vraiment c'est dur, ça n'aide pas à sortir de la crise, quoi.
All right, we've seen diverse views from Malians there. And there was one comment that struck me there, and that was that ECOWAS is actually working against Africa. So I'll come over to you, Ayodele. I said earlier on that the government in Mali has called for demonstrations on Friday against the ECOWAS sanctions. How effective do you think these protests will be?
Well, I mean, it's to my mind, it's a master stroke by the military government. And they're doing that precisely so the world can see who those sanctions will be affecting, which is the young people of Mali. And those are the people that are likely to flood the streets in protest, demanding a fair hearing from ECOWAS, and demanding that they have agency and it's their own country, and they're willing to give time to the military government to properly plan a new constitution and to pave the way for civilian administration. Now, if those people make a strong argument with the rally that's being planned, who am I sitting in Nigeria to now tell the ECOWAS community to force sanctions on the people who are willing to give negotiation a chance, right? So I think that it's a masterstroke from the military government to allow the Malian people to speak up to the entire world to say that they want a transition that does not involve punitive sanctions. They want the door for negotiations open, and they want to give a little bit of time to the military government or the military junta in Bamako to properly plan a transition and lay the grounds for a sustainable democratic administration that is likely to coming afterwards. To that extent, I see it becoming successful because, mind you, there is a growing anti-French sentiment amongst young people in Mali, where many of them are beginning to feel like the French or the government in Paris is largely responsible for a lot of the crises that we are facing, primarily the rise of non-state actors, especially from the northern part of the country. And to that extent, in fact, just like the Wagner issue is spewing up a new debate in Western nations, the average Malian sees them as people who have come into their country to train their military, to help them to fight or combat insecurity. And here you are sitting in London, sitting in New York, or sitting in Paris, saying that there are some group of mercenaries who lack legitimacy or who should not be allowed to operate within the country. And so these are the sentiments that Malians are beginning to see, and that is why they will be out, I think, in a day or two to make their voices heard across the world.
Ayodele, we're in 2022, and do you think times have changed that former colonial powers will allow what the people of their country want to do take precedence? Do you think they will be that generous to let the will of the Malians prevail? We do understand what happened post-independence in Guinea when Sékou Touré said he wanted out of the France-Afrique arrangement. You saw how vindictive Paris was. Do you think after putting troops, the amount of resources they spent in establishing bases in Mali, they will allow the will of the people prevail?
I mean, the good thing is that they are no longer the only horse in town. You are now beginning to see a growing influence from China and from Russia. And so you have a lot of African governments who now have what you would rather call a credible alternative. If you look at the amount of investment in terms of infrastructural development and foreign aid that is coming from China in the last decade to African governments, it is incredulously astonishing, the amount that has been invested by the Chinese government. And that, of course, has given so many sleepless nights to Western nations, where they have consistently put out several and tons of papers attacking the Chinese, calling their strategy a debt diplomacy that is aimed at plunging a lot of African nations in debt and chaos. But the reality on ground from the man in Guinea or in Bamako or in Dakar is that he sees the Chinese constructing roads, railways, and seaports. And that is what matters to him, not the bright grammar that is being spoken in Brookings Institute, right? And so the Western nations no longer have that sort of dominant influence in Africa as the case used to be. China is becoming a growing influence, and Russia is beginning to reassert itself in the continent.
Professor Kwesi, sorry to butt in there. Let's hear from Professor Kwesi. Do you actually buy this idea?
No, I mean, I agree with Ayodele 100%. The mistake people make is that China is not just coming into Africa. China has been here since 1890s. They built the Tanzam railway line. They've given hundreds of thousands of scholarships. Africa's relations with Russia dates back to the pre-revolution days. The Soviet Union then was a grand supporter and guarantor of our independence movement. So this is like history coming full circle. And it creates choices for people. The difference right now, and I think Ayodele has mentioned it, relates to the changing demographics, in which the sheer numbers, I mean, African states have grown like 300-400% since they got independence. And that calculus is what our former colonial Western masters don't want to accept. They've miscalculated, they've lost the plot, and they cannot issue instructions anymore because the French spoken in Paris, the mellifluous Uxbridge rhetoric from London is not understood by the youth. They don't care.
Okay.
Omodia needs
Professor Kwesi, we could go on and on all this, but of course it's worrying to know that the French, the colonial powers, actually backed the ECOWAS sanctions. But we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be looking into situations in Mali. Do stay tuned.
You're welcome back to the conversation. We still have Ayodele, Lawal, Adio, and Professor Kwesi Aning. Now it's time for us to shift our focus to Sudan. Yes, we've been talking about Mali in the first half. We'll touch up on things happening in Sudan right now. Now, following Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok's resignation, the civilian populace of Sudan has a tremendous capacity for civic mobilization, and the military are up against a relentless mass protest on the streets of Khartoum and other cities. But the United Nations has said it will launch talks to help Sudan resolve its escalating political crisis triggered by last year's military coup. This comes a day after Sudanese security forces again fired tear gas at anti-coup protesters, leaving 2 demonstrators dead.
فنؤكد التزامنا بأن نساعد قدر الإمكان لبناء مستقبل في حرية وسلام وعدالة. فأعتقد أنه إذا نبدأ بمشاورات فقد نساهم في هذه المستقبل. احنا بالحقيقة ميسرين ومسهلين. احنا قدمنا مشروع، وهذا المشروع اللي نقدمه هو مشروع تسهيل مشاورات بين السودانيين والسودانيات والأطراف السودانية عن طريقنا. يعني هي طبعا مشاورات غير مباشرة، هي غير مباشرة، فلذلك احنا جاءنا ونقول نريد أن نستشيركم. إذا الأمور تمشي بشكل جيد فقد نصل إلى توافق على بعض النقاط، فقد نصل إلى مرحلة نستطيع أن نقول هلا ننتقل إلى مرحلة ثانية. فالطاولة المستديرة التي حكى عنها رئيس مجلس الوزراء لما استقال، فالطاولة المستديرة موجودة، فإحنا يعني
Yeah, this coming Monday, January the 17th, the United Nations plans to invite Sudanese military leaders, political parties and other groups to take part in discussions aimed at ending the Sudan crisis unleashed by a coup in October. What are we to expect from this development, Professor Aning?
Well, I think the resignation of the Prime Minister puts a lot of pressure on the junta, at least to also sit down and begin to listen. I mean, we've seen in Khartoum and elsewhere in Sudan a very vibrant, determined, principled civil society movement that seeks to engage. I mean, the difference here in Sudan is that the military has lost credibility over so many years. I mean, there's been multiple iterations from when Bashir took over power and manipulated the process, stole, the country's monies, brutalized people, to such an extent that the military as an institution has lost credibility. And I think it's most unfortunate that an institution that's actually quite smart in knowing when to leave the scene in Sudan is failing so dramatically to do so. And until they recognize that they've lost this credibility and the people's trust and respect, and therefore they have to leave, I think the demonstrations will continue. The more violent the responses are, the more widespread the demonstrations will continue to become, and the country will basically grind to a halt. But I think change will come to Sudan much earlier than later. I'm quite optimistic for the Sudan.
All right, Ayodele, it's quite interesting to know that the willpower of the people is not dormant. They keep on asking for democratic and civilian transition. But we know that a leading Sudanese protest group has rejected United Nations initiative to hold talks with the military. It's quite surprising. But they insist that they don't want military-civilian transition, but they want a civilian transition. So what are the factors do you think that this protest group has rejected United Nations initiative to hold talks?
I mean, first, I think the Sudanese are now beginning to, I wonder where they have found this sudden courage that must be commended, and this commitment to democratic values and the aspirations to live under a democratically elected government. It's such a beauty to behold that even before military tanks and guns, they don't seem to be coward. The situation in Sudan is a bit tricky because as we speak, the country is facing a lot of, is it a debt crisis? There's a Paris Club debt that is amounting to about $23 billion. The United States have withheld aid running to about $700 million to the Sudanese government. The Supreme Council accepted an IMF recommendation which has led to the removal of subsidies for basic commodities, which has seen the prices of commodities skyrocket and is also fueling a lot of unrest in Sudan. So it's a very complicated and challenging situation that we have in our hands in Sudan that has only now been worsened by the resignation of the Prime Minister that has put unbelievable pressure on the military junta there. You'd recall that this is the second time, that they have done, or rather they have planned or effected a coup in the last 6 or 7 months. The first time that they did that and they agreed to a declaration where there was going to be a civilian administration and some sort of a Supreme Council that had 11 members, 5 were going to be nominated by the military and 6 by the civilian government. What eventually happened was that they reneged on the agreement and again toppled the administration and placed the Prime Minister on house arrest. When citizens went on the streets to protest, they reinstated the Prime Minister, and also after a while they began to interfere on the day-to-day running of the government. So it is clear that the military government are worried about what portends for their future should they relinquish power based on the history of human rights abuses, of theft, of corruption, and of, in many ways, high-handedness against the average Sudanese. So I think they worry much about what happens to them in the event of a civilian administration that will pursue far-reaching reforms that might hold a lot of them accountable to some of their crimes and actions in recent times. Okay. And to that extent, they are holding onto power as though their life depended on it, and not in the interest of the average Sudanese. And I think what will make the difference here, or what will prove the turning point, is the pressure, is the pressure mounted by ordinary citizens, and not even just the opposition politicians, but ordinary citizens on the streets who are going out to demand the civilian administration, to demand that the military, excuses its hold on power. That, for me, will be the turning point in Sudan. And I think if that pressure continues to mount, the military government will have no other option but to let go of power, even if it has to be through some sort of a backdoor arrangement.
Thank you very much, Ayodele. Professor Aning, we have 30 seconds just before we wrap up. I want to quickly take your analysis on this and your thoughts. The civilians have persisted in waging massive street protests to demand that the military relinquish power to civilians. And some analysts have perceived possible outcomes of a counter-coup within Sudan's fragmented military, or Sudan descending into civil war. How do you think this will play out? How do you see this ending?
Military is split. There are multiple factions. Some conservative, violent, others more tolerant of diverse opinions. But the civil demand for change will eventually win. I think the pressure is way too much, and eventually, even the most violent elements within the military will realize that they cannot, in the long term, hang on to power. They can see the ICC waiting for them. It will be wise for them to listen to their own people, and the people will win eventually. No doubt about it.
Thank you very much, Professor. And then I would like to say a very big thank you to you, Ayodele Lawal, Adio, Managing Editor of Avalon Daily, and Professor Kwesi, and then Director of Faculty of Academic Affairs and Research at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Accra, Ghana. It's been an absolute pleasure having you both on the conversation.
Okay, well, as he said, the real power of the people will continue, and at the end probably we'll see the people's voices being heard, and of course democratic transition being implemented in Sudan and of course in Mali. This will call it a wrap on today's edition of of The Conversation. I am Rita Omodia.
And I'm Gbenga, Aborowa. A lot is on our radar in Africa. Nigerians have started preparing towards 2022, and of course our radar is also on Zimbabwe. So see you on Friday for another edition of The Conversation. I'm Gbenga, Aborowa. Many thanks for joining us.